could be below the poverty line, they're still saying to themselves when they go to school, I need a watch, you know.
Yeah, and that in this analysis, it's the culture industry produces the mindset and then satisfies it with the product and benefits.
But is he saying that somewhere there's a cabal of people that are trying to keep it that way, or is he saying, or is he just making an observation about human nature and kind of showing the system that plays out from it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But they benefit from it. Like, if mass media can only exist if they have advertising and people paying for it, and advertising are they have a direct interest in it, because if they didn't sell this stuff and they didn't want people to want it, they wouldn't have these people to pay for their advertising. So the more people want the commercial goods and want that stuff, the more advertising they have, so they just keep benefiting.
I think Jeff's question is the question of the origin or the start of it. You know, what kickstarts a system? You know, it's a system. Did it just kind of evolve and grow, or is there somebody kicking it and tuning it, you know, as it goes? I don't think Hall is a conspiracy theorist. You know, I think most of the postmodern approach to this is that we created this through language and communication. And we often think we're creating something different than what we get. In systems theory, we talk a lot about unintended consequences. You know, so on the one hand, you produce a factory. I have a friend whose job was to automate automotive processes in Ford car production plants. He was a genius at it. He could take any job, and he figured, and because the bosses would come to him and say, look, these guys are getting sick laying under the cars welding. We want you to automate this process. And so he would automate it. He would create the machines to automate it. And they never fired, while he was there, they never fired anybody. They just didn't replace them so they never fired anybody. But he went around and he automated the whole thing for them. And he looks back on that and he says there was an unintended consequence to it. On the one hand, the guys were not getting their hands mashed or breathing in the stuff as they're under the car arc welding things. So he was doing good in his mind, but the net result of the system is to create an unintended consequence of what happens. So I think systems theory says at the end of the day there's nobody in charge of it. It's just a whole systemic thing that has developed unintentionally, but we have to realize we created it and we have the agency to change it. Like the global food distribution chain is a big thing right now. You know, how did we get into this situation where the average person's food comes from 1,200 miles? Do you remember the number?
I don't remember, but I remember eating for that.
Yeah, it was like 12. The average piece of food for American travels 1,200 miles on average to get to you. Well, and then now with this TOPS, we're calling 27 million pounds of beef. You know, we've created this incredible system where now they're going to have to throw away 27 million pounds of beef. You know, and you buy, and if it breaks down, we're in big trouble. You know, so who meant for that? Well, probably nobody meant for it. They wanted to control quality, so they centralized the production, and this is what we ended up with. So, yeah. So, but language and communication are very much a part of it, as the article in your book said. So let's jump to the article. Okay, let's jump to reading 3 in the book. We'll go over this for a little bit. Now, part of what you got to get at here is that Craig puts this article in the book. Okay, so Craig thinks this is an important article. And if you read on your own, if you feel like reading more, and you read the first 2 readings in this book, you'll wonder what is going on. Because when you read the first one about Homeric metaphors of communication, I had to get through that, and I was thankful that I had all my Greek background that I had, because I'm like, what is the average person going to think reading this article about the way the Homeric mind conceived of breath and communication, But what Craig wants us to do is to realize that we are standing on top of layers of historical thought about communication. And so he's like an archaeologist, here, who digs down and says, look at this artifact about communication from, 3,000 years ago. And don't forget that your ideas about communication are not like just dropped out of the sky. They have historical background to them. And so if you were to struggle through Craig's work a little bit, you would have a richer sense of the historicity of your thinking about communication. And so that's what he wants to do with this article about the invention of communication. And to make sense of this, you have to know a little bit about Cervantes and Don Quixote. And so somebody fill us in about Cervantes and Don Quixote. Who's a Cervantes expert? Anybody write their senior essay on Cervantes? Who's an author? Right? He writes a book. And it's a book about a person who's the end of a era. Don Quixote is the end of the chivalrous era. So he's a knight who, in a time when knights are done, but he's trying to live the chivalrous life, and so he goes out and he tilts at windmills, right? That's the, and he's nuts, but he's an honorable and chivalrous nut, and so the author says, in the time that Cervantes wrote, they were witnessing a move to a scientific world out of a enchanted world. And so that's part of the movement you have to catch here, is that he talks about this disenchantment of the world. So he's tracing this period where in this time communication was a rich term about communicating with God and saying chivalrous things and saying honorable things to others, and so communication had an enchantment to it. And enchantment means, well, what do you think enchantment means?
It's probably very much related to a way of life that is rooted in traditions and myths and rituals.
That there's some mystery left to it. That there are things that you don't know.
So a less pragmatic approach, let's say, but more of a, based on hierarchies as well.
On
very hierarchies.
I'm not.
Layers in society.
Okay, hierarchies. Okay, I'm sorry.
My pronunciation.
Hierarchies, yeah. So, right, and so social arrangements and staying within your realm and living by codes of honor and chivalry. We were just talking about crusades, and a lot of the crusades was about codes of honor and chivalry and defending things and so on. So you had that world, and it was giving way to this new world that was about science, rationality, engineering, and communication. So communication there's an idea here that this world is ignorant and full of bad parts. That there are these bad nature in different places that comes from isolation. This is a very important idea in this article, that if you have things that are isolated and not communicating with each other, then they go bad. The worst comes out of them. Now, this is interesting to think about. I don't know how many of you have ever been in places where there were dirt roads, poor communication. But there's some scary places in the world. I have been there. You know, I worked in South Carolina for a couple of years, changing car tires to work my way through graduate school. You know, and I worked, and I would sometimes have to deliver cars to places, and they would say to me, on your way to that place, don't go through here. You don't want to go through that town. Go around it. I suppose. I don't know. Is that true? A lot of isolated...
It's kind of very diverse. You find very developed, but then there's a lot of... It's very polarized. They have development in the important cities, but then there's very basic way of life.
Backward, rural, yeah.
Which are still agricultural.
Right. It can be very scary, and at least in my experience, it is isolated, and it's not the best, doesn't bring out the best nature in everybody to be isolated like that.
In New York, in I think it's like Orange County, last year at one of my classes in the history class, somebody was telling us that there's a town that is primarily Muslim, and like the whole town is run. And if people like drive through there from neighboring towns, like the one girl lived like 2 towns away, and she they warn you not to drive through it because if females drive through it, they throw rocks at the car, and like it's allowed because the whole town. I mean, I guess the county like hasn't stopped anything, but like multiple people have like knew about this place because they lived around it. Because it's so isolated, like things are allowed to go on because no one can be outside.
So this is kind of a innate idea for us, that if you have more communication, more interaction, you'll have less of this bad nature. I mean, I haven't even thought about it till just we're talking about this, but you know, with all these school shooting, the profiles of the school shooters, what is the profile of the school shooter? An isolated person, not in communication with others. So what you had was this idea emerged into France, and it hit France with the idea that we need to create a communication system in France that will improve the national character by allowing commerce and trade and the movement of hay and goods and horses throughout France. So communication became commerce. It was defined as we are communicating in France, meaning we're moving hay and pears and lettuces around, you know, this is communication. So the thought then became that if we can rationalize and engineer the communication system, we will perfect the civic body. So this is like 1600s. But this sounds an awful lot like modern organizational theory. You know, well, what we had to do is design the right networks where people are communicated with, and right organizational communication systems, and then our organization will function well and everyone will function at high capacity. Well, that's an idea that goes way, way, way back to this movement of civic engineering to build a communication system in France. And so Craig wants to make you aware that you could go back to Homer, or you can go back to the 1600s in France. You dig down, and what looks like a modern theory of organizational communication, you know, is 400 years old.
They have an expression in France. You guys must think I'm a big liar. I was in CBGB's and I lived in France.
That's okay.
But it's true. They say France profond, meaning deep France.
Okay.
And what it means is like this thing that you're discussing, that thing in South Carolina,
right?
Like that, where it starts to get a little bit weird. You know, like the teeth become less and less frequent, and more and more cows, and everybody knows what it means. But it occurs to me it kind of
right
has to do with what you're talking about here. And they'll like you'll go there and they still do weird stuff like. You'll be visiting, and like one of my kids had a fever, or no, a wart, right? And they said, well, bury an onion in the backyard. And completely serious. Take an onion, bury it in the backyard, the kid's wart will go away. And when you're at somebody's house, you kind of have to pretend.
Yeah.
Oh, great, thanks for the...
yeah, myth, ritual, mystery.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever read The Golden Bough by... who wrote that? Great book. It's a book that just chronicles all of that. Yeah.
To make a note of what we've just discussed about isolated things, because I was just thinking about the system theory and how it says that every system is part of a larger system. So an isolated place, let's say in the US, like South Carolina that you just mentioned, is very much different to an isolated place in France, let's say, or even in Eastern Europe. I mean, although they're traditional places that are very much based on myth and rituals, they wouldn't have that dangerous dimension that the one in the US has.
Right.
Because it's not the society that generates this sort of behavior like guns and yes, that sort of aggression. So it's not the same thing. It can be weird, and burying an onion in the backyard might seem weird because we have all sorts of traditions. But it's not dangerous at all.
Right.
Good. That's nice to hear.
Yes.
Good. Yeah. And they're, if you look at it that way, they're part of a system that goes back thousands of years in that sense. Yeah, and the American may be a little different because we don't have that long tradition. So when you isolate people from this and you put them in a system where it degenerates, I think we could say, and you get, we could have a whole conversation about that. So anyway, Craig's article points out the fact that there's this idea that you will perfect human society through communication. A root idea in our Western culture, that communication will lead to the perfection of people and of social life, the more communication we have. So it's not hard to see, to some degree, this same meme, I guess we could call it, or an idea concept, in globalization, which says if some communication is good, more is better. So let's have it all connected, and let's have it all interacting with each other. International, business and communication technologies, and it should make us better and better and better. I'm not so sure the internet is making us better and better and better. I don't know. We could have a discussion about that. But again, that's kind of a modernist concept. That there's an overarching meta-narrative and it's being driven towards perfectibility through communication. They talk about Descartes in there a little bit. I don't know how many of you are tuned in on Descartes, but Descartes is a very important figure historically, René Descartes. He comes at the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe. and where they're just deciding that we've got to find another way to do society other than we need a secular dimension to society. So Descartes is in this, and engineering and all of this is secular. It's not religiously driven. So so communication as physical transport, perfecting the state. Let's see what else I tagged here. Yeah, engineers serve reason by supporting communication. That was, the engineer is therefore invested with a mission to correct these inequalities, to allow the circulation of commodities. This conception makes the engineer the privileged servant of reason, since he combats prejudice by making men communicate. Interesting, right? That's back from the founding of the Engineer Corps.
I was just going to say, I thought it was kind of interesting because I remember like kind of in my intro to communication textbooks, like they always talk about communication and they kind of like describe it like with metaphorical water. And in one of them they used like metaphors of like locks and canals, like how you control like about like not communicating, but also like how to direct, how you
Really?
like direct the flow and stuff.
Yeah.
And then when I read it, like I was like, oh, maybe this is where
Where they got it from.
that's
Yeah.
where they got it from. Like,
Borrow, creative plagiarism, right? Borrow all these things. But you know, this idea that you can rationally engineer an improved society, you know, is kind of a big theme for a while. And in our field, it works itself out in the fight between the quantitative researchers and the qualitative researchers, right? If I'm a quantitative researcher, I apply nomothetic theories. You know, I want to find universal laws to govern my managing of communication so that I serve reason and perfect people's relationships. Of course, the interpretivists and the qualitative people say, no, it doesn't work that way. You know, you can improve canals and railroads that way, but people are different.
which area?
What's that? Am I a qualitative or a quantitative? I don't know. No one's asked me that recently.
You have to know.
I do?
When you do your, when you read or when you do your research.
When I do my research? But I'm not a researcher. I'm a scholar practitioner.
You need to. You
So I don't publish.
You need to know what you like
I don't
better.
publish research. Well, I'm a faith person actually. So that's a whole other ball game. You know, I have a whole faith dimension to my life. So, but I don't know. You know, I don't like the. I don't like the extremes of either. So, yeah. So that's what I'll say to that. But no, once you start getting into how to change the world, then we're talking other things. Right now I'm teaching communication theory, so that's what I'm doing. Yeah. All right, so let's, and he talks about the metaphor of the body and the blood circulating in the body. The circulation leads to health and life, and so the circulation of goods will lead to the health of the state, and the circulation of people will lead to improvement in their natures. So it's just, we always think in metaphors. We always think in archetypal metaphor. Are you familiar with the term archetypal metaphor? You should be familiar with the term. There are communication theorists. When I was in graduate studies at Temple University, I took a whole course in metaphor. And yeah, it's an interesting course. And there's a whole lot of writing that argues that people's lives are governed by deep metaphors that are basic metaphors, like the circulation of blood, and light and dark, and fire and heat and cold and sun, and basic human things. So there's a book, a sort of famous book on this by Robin Lakoff called Metaphors We Live By, in which she investigates the question of, are there root metaphors that govern our social lives from a communication standpoint. And her famous example in the book is that if you talk about argument with people, we have a metaphor of argument as fight, argument as warfare. So I defeated their argument. We blew them out of the water with our evidence. You know, we annihilated them. We're going to gather our resources and attack them. So that we structure our thinking about difference around warfare metaphors. And she plays with the idea in the book of what would happen if we were to kind of do a metaphorectomy. You know, pull that metaphor out and stick in another metaphor that said argument is dance. So that we would start then to think about, in our differences, how do we coordinate our differences? How do we use our differences to create something of beauty together? Not doing the same thing, but using our differences in order to create something new together. And her argument is that what we're dealing with there are archetypal metaphors, that if you were to shift the metaphor, you would shift a whole lot of other things, that they're at the root of thinking.
That exists, right? And what's that Brazilian sort of self-defense dance thing? Capoeira? Does anybody know?
Don't know it.
Makes sense to anyone. There's this. Okay. There's this kind of martial. It's Brazilian, and it's this combination exactly of that, of dance and combat.
Oh, really?
And yeah, it's called capoeira.
Capoeira.
Huh?
Capoeira.
Capoeira. See, I knew if I kept rambling on, somebody would
at
least correct me. Or
yeah, well, it's a question of how are our lives governed by basic metaphors. And archetypal metaphors are things that are, you know, natural: fighting, surviving, eating, drinking, light, dark, circulating blood. So Craig's article would make the argument that a lot of our concept of communication comes out of this archetypal metaphor of circulation that leads to health. So therefore, we think if we talk to each other, we'll have peace or we'll be better. Well, where do we get that idea from? Well, maybe it comes from metaphors. So, all right, so I thought that would be interesting for you. And not all the articles will be that historical, but I thought that was it was actually accessible. Some of the Homeric one was not accessible at all. I think Anna could read it because she knows all the Greek philosophy, but it's not very accessible. All right, any thoughts or questions? What did the article do for you? Did it? Was it interesting at all?
I didn't get it at first. I'm not gonna lie.
You didn't get it? Yeah.
I was like sitting there, I'm like, wait, did I miss some? Like I thought maybe I missed pages in the beginning.
I think all the articles in general are just like a lot just to comprehend all at one shot. So you gotta constantly read it and read it and read it to actually get what they're trying to.
Yeah.
At least from my standpoint, because I've done a lot of journal readings and stuff, but I still to this day have to go over it over and over just to make sure that I'm understanding what he's saying.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I always try to get if I can get the root idea, then so that helps.
I was interested in the idea of going back to sort of the layers thing, that we're standing on the shoulders of other people.
Right.
But there was a point when somebody had to sell this idea, you know, that we shouldn't be isolated, that, you know, why don't we try and figure out some way where we can get to each other. You know, this guy had to make a real pitch, you know, I mean, he had to go to the king, he had to go to the peasants and say, look, this can be good, you know, and people were, no, we want to be isolated, you know. He obviously had an argument. I mean, what's implicit there is that there was an argument against him, or else he wouldn't have had to come up with this sort of really sterling argument that he made, you know.
Yeah.
But it happens back and forth, I think, in like any culture. Like even if I'm not so great with like world history, But even if you look like at U.S. history and stuff, like, you know, there was World War I, like isolationist, and that's kind of like, you know, why it got so bad. And then there was the push, you know, to go out, and then people still don't want to go out because of what did like. There's always kind of that, and I guess it would be in any culture. Like, do you want to kind of stay to yourself or go out? And I think it kind of like shifts back and forth. Like, you expand a little bit, and there's backlash.
Well, and today, I mean, I have a friend of mine will not get an easy pass because she doesn't want. It's not like she's doing anything, but she just doesn't like the idea of them knowing where she's been. You know, so you get that people are like, I want to be a little isolated. I want a little privacy in my life.
Well, some people with like the outsourcing and stuff, like my history teacher last year, he was very upset about this like